Good afternoon. So, one of the things I wanted to talk about today is chapter 3. And originally, the first two chapters were called Initiation, and chapter 2 is called Integration, excuse me. So, initiation is when you come into something, right? It's something that you might not be accustomed to, but there might be some sort of ritual that comes along with it, which I mentioned. I didn't really talk about chapter two's integration. Integration obviously means that you go into something, right? You become a part of something. You assimilate yourself into it. You become so much a part of it that it almost becomes natural, right? And by this point in the novel, the biologist certainly has integrated herself far into Area X. She is no longer just a uh, avid participant in a world unknown. She's starting to know more, and she's starting to realize how crazy, how amazing and unknown it is, how alien it is, and something so foreign, but it's becoming almost normal at this point, right? And one of the things that's very interesting is that in the third chapter, she is much more open to what's going on. And in chapters 4 and 5, it gets to the point where she's like, well, is this really surprising anymore? So, chapter 3 is called Emulation. Emulation means to destroy something completely, both body and soul, something very important. So, in this case, we're not just talking about a death of a person, it's also the death of the soul, the death of who you were, right? And so it's very interesting that in this chapter, her identity and everyone else's identity will soon be sort of negated, right, as people, because we find out much more about what's going on in Area X, including the lies that exist within Area X. I noticed that chapter 3 is one of the shortest chapters in this novel. So that's kind of very interesting because it's the turning point of the novel. You would expect there to be a lot more information. However, it really focuses on the lighthouse, right? And what the lighthouse is all about. But there's also a scene which, if you're interested in the uncanny, you must look at. I think you'll really like it. So, in the beginning, the only thing that I really wanted to focus on is that she finally, for the first time, gives a name to the creature in the tower. She calls it the crawler. So, if you go to page 91 towards the top, it says, what role did the crawler serve? I had decided to call it and give it a name, right? So, now that we know that, this is going to become important, obviously, in chapter 5, because, hint, the one of the things that's going to happen is she's going to have to face the crawler one on one. So I've already given sort of the story away, but don't worry, we're already in chapter 3. We're more than halfway there. This is about halfway through the novel, and then she talks about all these different aspects of the crawler. And on page 92 and 93, if you're interested in focusing on this, um, she finally talks about whether or not the crawler has freedom of choice itself, or is it just a parasite or some sort of pawn for what's in the tower, or is it an integral part of the tower? So she says halfway down on page 92, despite my attempts to sustain the aria, the song in her head, I experienced a jarring reality. As I worked through these possibilities, suddenly I was just a person charging across a natural landscape of a type I had seen before. There's the canny. There were too many variables, not enough data, and I was making some base assumptions that might not be true, excuse me. For one thing, in all of this, I assumed that neither the crawler nor tower was intelligent in the sense of possessing free will. And notice that Vandermeer emphasizes this with his italics. Sorry, it's right there. So he italicizes it for a reason, meaning it's very important, right? It's for effect. something's going on here. My procreation theory would still apply, but there were other possibilities. The role of ritual, for example, in certain cultures and societies. How I long for the anthropologist's mind now, even though in studying social insects I gained some insight. So once again, she's changing and adapting her mindset as a biologist, right? A biologist studies things, observes things, and then makes assumptions off of those things. But when there's not enough data, what do? This is what we call objective reasoning. You only have so much to go by, and then you make your best guess, right? And so, if you want to requote this, one of the things that I find interesting, does the crawler or tower possess free will? If it does, how do you know this? If it does not, how do you know this from the novel itself? When it encounters her in chapter 5, that is the crawler, how does it react? What are some of the things you notice about it? What make it uncanny and in some ways unnerving? Does it really have power, or is it just continuing what it's always done? All right, I'm going to kind of skip through this here, and I wanted to talk about pages 96 to 98. Okay, 96 to 98. This is very, very important. And one of the things that I wanted to show you is a nice little photo which you can find on our Canvas page, because they show this scene in the novel. This scene is where they go into a sort of deserted village and they see a whole bunch of flowers that look like in the shape of a human. And then the biologist, Natalie Portman, suggests that this is possible, that they could have done this, and that they have a physicist who kind of concurs with that. And she says, "Oh my God, it's reflective." In other words, or excuse me, it's refractive, meaning that if it encounters your DNA, it can sort of mimic it, right? And this plays a central role in chapter 5 because the way that the crawler works with the biologist is through mimicking. So let's see here. Actually, I'm not sure if I have the image, but if you want to see the image, I will show it to you a little bit later. But here's how they describe it anyway. The deserted village had sunk into the natural landscape that I did not see it until I was upon it. And so she sees towards the middle in the second body paragraph, but in what had been kitchens or living rooms or bedrooms, I also saw a few peculiar eruptions of moss or lichen, rising 4 or 5 feet tall, misshapen, the vegetative matter forming an approximation of limbs and heads and torsos. In other words, if you want to talk about the uncanny creatures, this is a good one, right? So in this case, there's a whole bunch of moss, and it looks to be in the form of a human. It's 4 to 5 feet tall, which is huge. And again, this is a big part in the film. As if there had been runoff from the material, too heavy for gravity, that had been congregated at the foot of these objects, or perhaps I imagine this effect. So because they look like humans, this shows you the uncanny nature, right? You know it's the form of a human. That's familiar. What is unfamiliar is moss does not gradually grow into the form of a human. It has to mimic it. It has to create the DNA sample. It can't just replicate it out of nowhere. So how? The question would be, how is this moss able to turn itself into a human? And what if the other creatures could do something similar? And this is put into question in the next paragraph. One particular tableau struck me almost in entirely an emotional way. 4 such eruptions, one standing, 3 decomposed to the point of sitting, with a coffee table and a couch, all facing some point at the far end of the room. The smell of lime and mint unexpectedly arose, cutting through the must alone. And again, she doesn't want to say anything about it, but it's pretty hard to ignore, right? The uncanny is right there in front of her. She knows that moss does not naturally look like a human. Although it can take on different shapes, it won't take on a perfect shape of a human unless if it knows that's what it wants to do. So on page 97 is when she decides to leave the village, and this is when she finds dolphins. Breach. But there's something about these dolphins. So again, if you're going to talk about the uncanny creatures in this novel, you can't escape this one either. I knew that dolphins here sometimes ventured in from the sea, had adapted to the fresh water, but when the mind expects a certain range of possibilities, aka the canny, any explanation that falls outside of that expectation can surprise, uncanny. Then something more wrenching occurred, more uncanny, even more unsettling. As they slid by, the nearest one rolled slightly to the side and stared at me with an eye that did not, in that brief flash, resemble a dolphin eye to me. It was painfully human, almost familiar. In an instant that glimpse was gone, and they had submerged again, and had no way to verify what I had seen. Okay, here's the Uncanny 101, right? Something, and she's using specific words that if you wanted to requote, I would definitely use. So the first is mind expects and certain range of possibilities, right? So mind expects. Your mind expects to see a dolphin, and they can do all kinds of things, right? But things are usually within the realm of possibilities, right? However, any explanation that falls outside of that can surprise and make it uncanny, unfamiliar, and very unsettling. The word wrenching means that something even crazier happened, something very unexpected, which is very unnerving. And again, dolphins normally will flip to the side because they do that to kind of be playful, right? With humans and other animals. That's the way of interacting with one another. And it stared at me with the eye. Now, the eye is very important. That did not, in that brief flash, that's okay, resemble a dolphin eye. That's the next thing you want to requote. Resemble a dolphin eye to me. So she knows what a dolphin eye looks like. You know that they kind of have a blank stare. It may have a sort of smile or looks like a smile, but you know what it looks like. But it was painfully human. So you want to definitely highlight that word painfully. Because why? It's unsettling. It's uncanny. How can it be like a human and be almost so familiar and yet it's not? So uncanny. So that is another way to do the requoting, right? If you wanted to choose this sort of quote, I think it's a very good one. Okay. And again, she continues towards the lighthouse on page 98. And then it says, it loomed larger, almost heavy, its black and white stripes topped with red, making it somehow authoritarian. So the color red usually means love, death, but it can also mean power, right? And in this case, she's saying this lighthouse looks scary, foreboding, and not what you would think, right? Again, remember what we had said before in chapter 1. I called it and defined it as something that is light, something that provides a fortress that provides safety and harbor, right? In this case, she makes it sound negative. It's got black and white stripes and red. Ooh, looks authoritarian. And authoritarian means that it's very powerful, very regal, but also extremely strong and powerful, and sometimes even considered like a threat. Which is why further down she says, perhaps it looked, and I'm adding some words here, perhaps it looked like even a threat. So in this next part, I'm going to talk about what she sees at the lighthouse, and then, of course, her interaction with our favorite friend, the psychologist. So, I will talk to you soon about this, okay? Thank you.